Good evening. My name is Father Joseph Aboid, and I am the Dean of St. George Cathedral in Coral Gables, Florida. And I will be reading to you lessons 3, 8, and 12 from the Good Samaritan, a children's catechism. Lesson 3, the sickness of sin. In the last lesson, we learned what led to a time out for the first man and woman, our ancestors, Adam and Eve. What happened, and why did God have to put them in timeout? He had created them with the ability to live forever in communion and enjoyment with Him. They were like children who had the choice of how they would grow up, into perfection with God, in obedience to Him, or by going their own way. God had given them only one rule. Please, don't eat of that tree because it will make you sick and you will die. That tree is life without me. Genesis 2:17. What did our ancestors do? They were tempted by the devil. He lied to them. He always lies. He told them, God does not want you to eat of that tree because He knows it will allow you to grow up and make your own decisions. You will be an adult now and do what you want. It will make you like God. Genesis 3:4. And the fruit of that tree looked really delicious. But when they ate, something terrible happened. Their lives changed for the worse. They didn't become like God. They became sick with sin. Sin separates us from God. Adam and Eve lost their beautiful robe of light, and they entered a life of pain and suffering. God gave them a chance to tell the truth about what they did, but instead of confessing, they blamed one another. They blamed God's creation. God took them out of paradise for a time out. He would wait for the right time to send the medicine to make them well again and bring them back to life. The darkened icon. God saw that Adam and Eve had made themselves sick with sin, and because He loved them, He sent them out of paradise so they would not live forever in sickness, sadness, and pain. Because their souls were now sick, their bodies would also eventually die. But God did not create Adam and Eve to die. He did not create death. He was so sad to see their hearts darkened and sick with sin. For this meant their hearts could no longer see Him and experience His perfect love. Because we are children of Adam and Eve, we also live with this sickness. What is this sickness of sin? And how can we become healthy again? We have already learned that God created us in His own image, with His own stamp. Have you ever gotten a stamp on your hand? What kind of image or picture did the stamp make? What do you think God's stamp is? God's stamp is Jesus Christ. Jesus is God's image, His icon. Colossians 1:15. He made Adam and Eve and every person ever born with the stamp or icon of Jesus in his or her heart. Did you know you have the icon of Jesus in your heart? God created Adam and Eve with a beautiful icon of Christ stamped on each of their hearts. But when Adam sinned, the icon became dark and dirty. The icon was covered over by sins, like mud or dust covers over a window or a beautiful picture. Imagine a bright and beautiful icon of Jesus Christ. Now imagine that the same icon has been buried in the ground for many, many years. What has happened to the icon? It has become dark and dingy, dirty and dim. Can you see the image well now? No. It needs to be cleaned. This is what happened to Adam and what happens to us because of sin. Now, after Adam sinned, he had difficulty seeing the stamp of Jesus in his heart. This means that Adam forgot about God and thought mostly about himself and his own desires. He no longer sensed that God was in him and with him. Do you ever forget about God? Before he sinned, Adam never forgot about God, whether he was walking or eating or enjoying the creation or even sleeping. What causes us to forget our Creator? The sickness of sin causes us to forget or even to ignore God. Our forgetfulness of God is a sign of our spiritual sickness. The sickness that came into the world when Adam and Eve sinned. Who could clean the darkened icon in man's heart? Who could restore or clean up the perfect picture of Christ in us? Who could make man's heart healthy again? Could Adam? Eve? Could the holy prophet Moses? Or even St. John the Baptist? No. No one but Jesus Christ himself could do this. We'll learn about this in the next lesson. How else was Adam sick with sin? God made man's heart so that he could see him and see angels and see all of creation as God's gift and blessing. God created us with spiritual eyes. This is a kind of eyesight that can see or understand things that are normally invisible to our physical eyes. Ephesians 1:18. Our church fathers call this the eye of the soul. In the Greek language, the eye of the soul is called nous. Do you have a nous? Maybe no one ever told you before, but you do have a nous. Your nous is deep in your heart where God's image is. If your nous is clear and clean, you can sense God in everything. Just as when your physical eyes are open and work well, you can see everything around you. But if your nous is darkened by evil thoughts and sins, you are like someone who walks with his eyes closed or who forgets to turn on the light at nighttime. When our nous is healthy and good, we keep our spiritual eyes on God. We remember Him. We can feel Him and hear Him. Have you ever looked through a window at nighttime? What do you see? Darkness, right? When our nous is dark, when the light of God is not in us because of sin, we can't see God clearly. Matthew 6:22-23. When Adam sinned, his nous, the eye of his soul, was darkened. Now he felt as if God was no longer with him, that he was far, far away. Was God far away? No, God was not far away. But because of sin, Adam was trying to find God through a dark window, through his darkened nous. Not being able to see God with the eyes of his soul made Adam spiritually sick. Instead of loving God, he began to love things he could touch with his hands, hear with his ears, see with his eyes, taste with his mouth, and even smell. Those things are not bad, but Adam tried to replace God with those things that made him feel good for a short time. God created the things of the world to help us remember Him and love Him, not to replace Him. But now Adam used the things of the world to try to make himself happy without God. Are we happy without God? Some people try to be. What kind of things do people use to make themselves happy without God? Money, food, other people, things they buy, and much more. When Adam's spiritual eyes was darkened, he developed what we call passions. And all of us who were born of Adam also have passions. What are passions? Passions are strong desires that turn us away from God and His goodness. They tempt us to think or do evil, or to lose faith in God, or to hate or hurt others who are made in God's image. Do you know the names of any of the passions? Anger, hatred, selfishness, jealousy, fear, lying, hopelessness, greed, pride, etc. Have you ever felt any of the passions? Are you sure? The passions are like magnets that have attached themselves to our hearts. Our passions are attached to sin, like one magnet is attracted to another. Like a magnet, when our passions get too close to sin, they want to stick to them. These passions pull us down toward sin. And the more we sin, the stronger the magnetic force becomes. Sometimes it feels we can't stop from sinning, but with God's grace we can. Everyone has passions, even the saints. But the saints fought hard to keep the passions out of their hearts. They didn't let the passions control them. Galatians 5:24. We can follow the way of the saints too. The more they resisted sin, the more their magnets, passions, lost power to pull them into sin. Their passions found a different direction. They turned their passions over, away from sin and toward God. Then they were free to move toward God. They were no longer slaves to sin, Romans 6:6, but servants of God, Romans 6:22. In the same way, when we continually turn our hearts to God, we are no longer pulled toward sin. Sin no longer sticks to us. The saints cleaned their hearts from the dark passions so that the light of God could come in. When the light of God comes into our hearts, we can see what is really important and true. Our spiritual eye, our nous, is filled with the light. We find joy and peace. Then we can turn our attention to the love of God and our neighbor. It's hard to keep our attention on God, isn't it? We get distracted. Do you know what it means to be distracted? It's when we try to focus on something, but something else grabs our attention. Does that ever happen to you? How about when you're in church? When you pray, do you ever get distracted and begin thinking about something else? It happens to most of us. Do you know why? Because our attention, our nous, is distracted. We are distracted from God. We begin thinking about something we really want and forget about God. We are disturbed or become afraid, and we lose faith in God. This is part of the sickness of sin. Remember when the disciples were in the ship and Jesus was down below sleeping? A storm came, and the winds were fierce, and the waves tossed the boat around. The disciples became afraid and lost their faith, even though Jesus was right there with them. Matthew 8:23-27. So now, we know what it means to be sick with sin. Number 1, the icon or image of God in us becomes dark and dirty. Number 2, the eye of our soul, our nous, is darkened and no longer sees God or hears His voice clearly. Number 3, we become filled with the passions, the magnets that try to pull us toward sin. Number 4. And worst of all, sin and death comes to live in our souls and bodies. Next, we will learn how God's Son, Jesus Christ, provides the medicine to save us from all the sins, from all these, and make us well again.